Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. This lecture is not one that you absolutely have to watch, no quiz questions on it. I had promised to do a coda on timelines, and your second stage of your project will be timelines. And then I changed my mind and didn't do it as a coda. So I'm giving you a bonus lecture that will go under the project stages part on the module, just to give you some ideas about timelines, what's good, what's bad, what I like, what I don't like, what you might like or not like. Timelines basically tell you what they are in the name. It's time on a line or a squiggle sometimes. But there are many different styles of timelines. Some are more helpful than others, and the formatting often depends on your taste, your audience, and what you are trying to get across. In this bonus lecture, I'm just going to share some timelines that other people have made. You might note the theme of each timeline and what information the creator has chosen to present, meaning also what they have decided to leave out. You can also think about which styles you like and perhaps why these strike you. The timeline on the left comes from Ford, the automobile manufacturer, and the one on the right from Audi. These both have dates, but there is no clear scale of time. So, for instance, in the Ford timeline, it is difficult to tell at a glance that 1913 and 1914 here are only 1 year apart, whereas 1954 and 1964 here are 10 years apart. They look sort of the same, this 1 year, 10 year, and actually I measured it and they are the same. That can be confusing for the people who are looking at your timeline. It's nice to give people an idea of what happened close to one another and what happened further away in time. And you can see a similar sort of thing going out here on here for Audi, although they have tried to put a regular timeline up at the top. These timelines on the slide currently are for types of lighting. The one on the left, the evolution of the light bulb, is attractive, but on the other hand, it's not particularly informative, not having any dates. We could tell the sequence, but not anything else, although we can tell the shape of the light bulbs or the source of light since they weren't always bulbs. The rather standard timeline on the right is extremely informative, but it's not as much fun. It is possible to create something which is both fun and informative, but you have to decide where you want to put the emphasis for your project, probably on being informative. But if you are an artist, then fun also, artist in any kind, officially or not. These timelines on this particular slide present European armor and the history of European armor. The one on the upper left is a general overview from 1100 to 1610. And notice that the two ends of the timeline are marked. The artist has sacrificed an evenly divided timeline in order to include and highlight the images. The timeline on the right is just for the development of European breastplates from 1100 to 1700. The creator has dealt with the issue of including images with a fairly, not perfectly, but fairly regularly divided timeline in an interesting way, and has also shown branches off of what they are considering their mainstream. And you can see this one is a squiggle and not a line. The timeline on the bottom left is quite specific. It is limited to Italian cuirasses of the 15th century. Here we have apples. On the left is a timeline of Apple development, so this only goes for 1 year. The letter and number combinations probably indicate time, but since I don't know how to interpret them, I can tell order or sequence, but I cannot tell exactly when to expect each stage. The timeline on the right is a fairly classic vertical timeline, giving us information on the history of apple cultivation in Montana from the 1840s to 1920. Anything that changes over time, meaning anything with history, is fair game for a timeline. Here we have very focused timelines relating to developments in forensic science. The bottom one is DNA typing of forensic samples and different changes in methodology over time. I got my master's degree for this sort of work here in the 1990s when countertop PCR was new, and Spouse worked on the Human Genome Project. You can see when that sort of started and sort of ended from the timeline. The timeline on the top shows the history of one particular forensic laboratory. Here we have shoe timelines. The timeline on the left is actually fairly useless when it comes to information, but it amuses me. Aesthetically, I find it very fun. The one on the right is an example of a really good timeline, the kind of thing that I hope you all come up with at least as a basis. It tells you exactly what and when it covers, and the relative spacing over time is consistent. They're going in 20-year intervals here so that you can see basically what's happening close together, boom, 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 and where there's a space of time between a couple of developments. There is lots of information here if that is information that you are looking for. This is a shoe made in 1973 Italy. It currently lives in the LACMA, or LA County Museum of Art in LA. It is here because it makes me smile. Back to timelines. On the left is a timeline of Western art movements. I find the presentation here really frustrating because the orange line suggests there is a continuous sequence following the line. Whereas if you look at the dates, the date ranges read left to right, regardless of which way the line goes, which is confusing to your viewer or reader. The people who have made this also have done something funky with the spacing on the dates for the neoclassical period here, with comparison to other movements. Make sure that your timeline is consistent and attractive enough in the sense that it is easy for your reader to follow. If it's super messy, even if it checks off all of the boxes, it won't get a passing score. It takes a little digging to find a comparable timeline for other regions of the world, especially ones written in English, for the obvious reason that I am not proficient in other languages. The art history timeline on the right is for the Philippines. This art history timeline tries to be absolutely comprehensive in every way. There are multiple geographic regions, along with both abrupt, that's where you just see little points, and gradual changes over time. I put the website because you can zoom in and play with the timeline. So that's one approach. If we just look at the timeline like this, there is far too much there to pay attention to. But they have constructed it with the idea that people will zoom in on particular parts. You can also buy a paper copy to put up on your wall. I have given you this timeline because I found that many Americans only associate the word modern with the 20th century and on. But for Europe, the early modern period basically goes from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. And this will matter for us because much of the colonization by Europeans in North America started to happen in the early modern period. This is political history focused on political parties in the US, from the end of the Civil War, basically, through the 19th century. So basically the second half of the 1800s. And you can see they've used color coding, they've used places with text to explain things, and they've shown where things cross over. So if you know generally what you are looking for, this is a fabulous timeline. This is on the left is a fairly simple or simplified timeline of Western economic history. On the right, there's a more complex representation of the same thing, economic history in the West. But obviously, it contains much more detail and more information. It's not that one of these is better than the other, but they are intended to convey different amounts of detail for different purposes. Sometimes simpler is better, sometimes you want more information. Here we have the periodization or division of French history over here on the upper leftish and American history over here on the lower rightish. You will notice that these are not the same because French historians define things in terms of their own country developments and Americans define things in terms of their country developments. Also, so that you know, this is fairly standard here, but different people do divide things up differently. So, for instance, Gilded Age and Progressive Era, sometimes by historians now, these are lumped together into one era. And depending on what you want to stress, colonial America is actually pretty broad, and this is focused largely on British colonization and not, say, Spanish colonization. This one is education history, and it is a timeline of when people were awarded doctorate degrees or PhDs in the United States. I personally was surprised by this because I would have thought the degree would exist earlier. But if you look back into the 19th century, there are a number of different degrees that no longer exist. So part of what you're seeing here is a difference in idea about what should be awarded a college degree and what really isn't, what can be lumped together and what won't be. The other thing I'd like you to notice down here is the first Morrill Land Grant and the second Morrill Land Grant. I know I say Morrill and Morral as if they're very similar. So this is Morrill, named after a person. Your current university, the University of California at Davis, is a Morrill Land Grant institution. And those are colleges that were funded with money from the federal government. And they tend to be colleges that admitted Black Americans, women, and other groups not quite equally with white men, but well ahead of what many of the private colleges did. And finally, since fashion history is a legitimate field that offers a doctoral or PhD degree, here is a bit of self-indulgence. Once upon a time, when I had free moments to breathe in my life, I like to do historical costuming. On this particular timeline, you might think about which times and places are included and why. So we skip Stone Age to Egypt, to Greece, to Romans. Byzantine, we kind of head off a little bit, and then we stick to Europe and the United States down to the end. That's kind of an odd transition, and there's definitely some weeding out of other groups that could have been represented here. You might also notice that apparently men only had fashion in the Stone Age, ancient Rome, when women seem to have disappeared for a bit, and then in Byzantium you have men and women, and then men drop off of the face of the earth for the remainder of the timeline. Perhaps they came back after the 1960s. These are just a few examples. I am happy to have you do squiggles as long as people can tell what is happening close together in time and what is happening further apart. I would like you to have some explanation of what you've chosen. And in that explanation, let your reader know basically why. Don't say, I have included this because, but let them know how this mattered. Something like World War I, which is not going to be part of your timeline in this class, but you might indicate to your viewer that you were interested in World War I because at that point there was, say, a change in the employment of married women, something like that. All right, things to think about. And I hope you have some fun making the timeline too. I personally have a lot of fun making timelines, which is weird. I know, but be weird like me.